Our first speaker today is Alena Pacheco, who last year when she wrote this paper was a freshman, is currently a sophomore. And last I looked, she was majoring in psychology, despite my best efforts in her case and everyone else to turn people to philosophy. And Alena is going to be talking on Penelope in Homer's Odyssey. It's yours.
Okay, I know the flyer says that it was called The Trophy That Is Penelope, but there was a title change. I changed it to Loyalty Woven with Weakness. Okay. Penelope, the woman a great war hero leaves his goddess lover for. So desirable that over 100 of Ithaca's finest young suitors seek her hand, the ideal Greek woman. Penelope is sought after for her status as queen and her legendary beauty. Yet she is depicted as nothing more than Odysseus' trophy wife, and a potential prize given to the winning suitor. Penelope is known only for her beauty and loyalty, making her the perfect subservient wife to any Greek man of the time. Her suitors prey upon the fact that she is hospitable, kind, and flawless despite her sorrow. Though Penelope is strong enough to hold off the suitors for a few years, they take advantage of her inferior position as a female and rudely help themselves to everything Odysseus has left her, slowly destroying her home. Throughout his travels, Odysseus remarks how anxious he is to get home, yet he seldom mentions returning to Penelope. Rather, he wants to be immortalized in a song. When offered immortality by Calypso in exchange for his freedom, Odysseus opts to remain mortal and take his chances voyaging home. That way, if and when Odysseus finally gets his homecoming, his legacy will live on forever in an epic poem. Odysseus does not really care for his wife nearly as much as he cares about getting his song and metaphorical immortality. Though Penelope is a weak and two-dimensional character, she signifies home for Odysseus, if only as an extension of his glory. Notably, Penelope's character seems to revolve around her constant objectification. Not only is she reduced to a trophy by her husband and suitors, Penelope objectifies herself before the archery contest. She tells her suitors, "Here is a prize set out before you," implying the prize for the archery contest to be her hand in marriage. Penelope embraces and renews the objectification placed upon her by the suitors. This is actually the second time Penelope's hand has been offered as a prize for a contest. Her marriage to Odysseus took place after he beat her father in a foot race, winning her hand. By passively allowing the demeaning label of prize to continue, Penelope displays her character as weak and submissive. Penelope's virtue is so admirable that Agamemnon provides her immortality by means of an epic. His soul says, "Thereby the fame of her virtue shall never die away, but the immortals will make for the earth, people of the earth, a thing of grace and a song for prudent Penelope." Clearly, Penelope's virtue is just as important as Odysseus' whole journey, since she receives a song as well. The morality of Penelope was so great that she receives the highest honor of a poem. By remaining loyal and virtuous, even when all seemed to be lost, Penelope was regarded as godlike, and praised by all of Greece, eventually eternalized in her own song. Still, it is understandable how Penelope had to use her mind and appearance to manipulate the suitors, since she could not overpower them physically or force them to leave. Since her son was too young to help drive out the suitors, Penelope had to take matters into her own hands and beguile them instead. Using her cleverness and knowledge of Greek tradition, Penelope was able to pit the suitors against each other while simultaneously creating more time for Odysseus to return. Penelope had no other choice but to bide her time by leading the suitors on with individual promises. By sending out separate messages to each of her suitors, Penelope guaranteed that they would not utilize their advantageous numbers to band together and force a marriage decision out of her or cause any physical harm. This ensured both her and Telemachus' safety. Also, her strategy to weave and unweave a burial shroud for Laertes bought her time and safety until Odysseus could return. Ancient Greek culture demanded a body to be wrapped in a shroud before burial, and the suitors would not have dared to break religious tradition. The suitors respected the Greek mythology too much to interfere with Penelope's weaving of the burial shroud for her father-in-law. Exploiting the suitors' strong faith in the gods, Penelope kept them at arm's length and protected herself and her son. Though Penelope's character is tragically underdeveloped, she is reconcilably essential to the story. The entire poem revolves around Odysseus' return to Penelope and her role with the suitors. By signifying home for Odysseus, she provides a beacon of hope to him and inspiration for him to return, even if only as an extension of his fame. The entire course of the story would be altered without her existence. Also, Odysseus probably would not have had a home to come back to without Penelope deviously keeping the suitors at bay. If Odysseus had left for Troy without an adult behind to run Ithaca, his home and kingdom would have been swiftly conquered, plunging Ithaca into chaos. With Telemachus too young to defend the house, Penelope's existence, while fragile, prevented Odysseus' home from being sacked. Penelope's role in preserving the Ithacan crown is essential. The queen's presence retained a ruler on Ithaca's throne, even if only to hold it until Telemachus came of age or Odysseus returned. Penelope ensured Ithaca would not see a mad scramble for power without a leader by guarding the crown. By providing stability to both her home and entire country, Penelope redeems her weak, underdeveloped character and has an essential role in the epic tale of Homer's Odyssey.
Our second speaker today is Matthew Schulte, and Matthew, I know, has taken several philosophy courses. His paper is on human imperfection and divine intervention on Homer's Odyssey. Matthew is currently a sophomore at Roosevelt, but was a freshman when he wrote this paper. He's a sociology major. But I'm going to be trying to convince him as best I can that he needs to be at least a double major in sociology and philosophy. But Matthew has written a very good paper. Matthew?
Good morning. For better or for worse, I have been placed under the rule of Warnerian and Minkovian philosophy, and I feel it's certainly reflected in my paper here. So I'll let you all take it as you will.
And blame them for
This is your fault. In countless cases throughout the Odyssey, humans lay blame for the misfortunes they endure on the gods. However, in most, if not all cases, blame falls with humans themselves for making selfish and impious choices that anger the gods. In some instances, humans knowingly defy the gods and challenge their metaphysical authority. But the gods themselves are not wholly without blame, some choosing to side with and aid humans that other gods despise. This creates an intricate web of justified and unjustified blame between multiple humans and gods alike. The complex nature of conflicts throughout the story is first seen in the start of the poem, where Athena learns of and displays scorn for the suitors when meeting with Telemachus, son of Odysseus. However, Odysseus' delayed homecoming is, at first, by no invention of his own, but rather is the work of Poseidon, who is furious with Odysseus for blinding his son, Polyphemus the Cyclops. Some blame for the discontent between humans and gods falls on Odysseus for being so careless as to attack the son of a god. From another point of view, Poseidon is to blame for taking such harsh action against Odysseus for simply defending himself. Now Athena gets involved, determined to help Odysseus towards his homecoming, in defiance of Poseidon's wrath. Such is the multifaceted nature of conflict between humans and the gods throughout the Odyssey. At the beginning of Odysseus' tale, he is found trapped on the island of Calypso, Ogygia, where he has been held captive by her for 8 years. He blames Calypso for holding him there, though he has been sleeping with her and making no effort to leave. It is not until Hermes is given the task by Zeus to send word to Calypso to free Odysseus, who builds a raft out of trees on the island, a task that could have been completed very shortly after his arrival, that he leaves his place of captivity. Zeus himself, after speaking with Athena, is even convinced that it is by Calypso's harshness alone that Odysseus is trapped. It is also worth noting that Proteus, the old man of the sea, believes as well that Odysseus is being held completely against his will when he tells Telemachus, "That was Odysseus, son of Laertes, who makes his home in Ithaca, whom I saw on an island weeping big tears in the palace of the nymph Calypso, and she detains him by constraint, and he cannot make his way to his country." This illustrates the widespread human belief that humans are without fault, and the gods, who were responsible for Odysseus' release from Calypso and to an extent his return home, are to blame for the shortcomings and tragedies of humans, who disregard their own role in the godly penalties they are faced with, as is the case with Odysseus and his bedmate Calypso. Calypso's island of Ogygia is but the first of many instances along Odysseus' path toward home that questionable blame can be seen throughout the story. The final question to be asked is whether Odysseus is to blame for the suitor's ransacking of his home, his wine, his cattle, and his belongings, due to his own lack of effort at times in returning home from his journey. Staying with Circe for 1 year and Calypso for 8 clearly shows his reluctance to return home, as much as he claims to miss Penelope. With this in mind, where does the blame truly fall throughout the story for all of Odysseus' misfortunes? Is it with the suitors, who constantly plague his mind with the thought that his wife is being tormented in his own home while he is absent? Or are they within their bounds to court a grieving, vulnerable woman whose husband has been long lost and to defend themselves against his wrathful and also grieving son? Is it with the gods, who perpetually delay his return with divine interventions? Or are they simply guarding that which is theirs, such as in the cases of Poseidon and Helios? Or is the fault with Odysseus alone, for taking irresponsible liberties not inherent to a married man with obligations to his family, who instead chooses to squander away nearly a decade of his life to selfish merriment and lavishness? Perhaps the lesson Homer wants to teach with the Odyssey is simply to keep in mind at all times the consequences of one's actions and how they impact those around them, particularly those that love them most.
The final paper of our first session this morning is by Thomas Smith. And Thomas is an actuarial science major, or have you switched to accounting?
No, I switched to accounting.
Switch to accounting. And if professors ever made money, might be able to use Thomas's services, but they surely would provide a practical necessity for somebody. Thomas's paper, unlike prior to, is on Plato's Apology of Socrates, and it's on the city of Athens versus Socrates. And Thomas wrote the paper. As did our first two speakers as a freshman, and he's a sophomore now. Thomas.
Thank you.
Welcome.
With the power used to command nations, men can also destroy empires. Perhaps the greatest weapon one can use against others is the word of mouth. While a verbal attack does no physical harm, the indirect damage done to the victim is oftentimes undeniable. Today's social media is an accurate illustration of how words can have a lasting and sometimes permanent impact on the recipient. The statements made against the intended victim, whether or not they are true, become indelible scars that can take a lifetime or more to wash away. The use of words against others has existed since the development of human language. Spoken word has served humanity as both an essential tool and a dangerous weapon. During the trial of Socrates, as recounted by Plato in his Apology of Socrates, the use of words as a weapon against Socrates was intended to place him in a negative light and to convince the Athenian public that his philosophical beliefs were dangerous. The allegations of Socrates' accusers stemmed from their belief that Socrates did not believe in the same gods as the Athenians, but rather in strange daimonia. At the time, it was deemed intolerable in Athenian society for one to question the wisdom of government leaders, much less that of the gods from whom civic leaders took direction. Socrates, however, was a man who pushed beyond these social limitations and challenged various public figures, as well as the Oracle of Delphi, and by extension, Apollo himself. The end result was, of course, his execution and increased criticism of his philosophical beliefs. Though he never described himself as a teacher, Socrates often conversed with people in the marketplace about various subjects. In the process, the local youth gathered to listen to him. Although a traditional teacher-pupil relationship never existed between Socrates and these youth, it cannot be denied that the youth certainly learned from him. Socrates' influence on these developing minds, though unintended, had the powerful impact of instilling them with questions concerning the workings of nature and the existence of the gods. For the Athenians, these questions, being formed by the youth as a result of listening to Socrates, were viewed as dangerous to the stability of the Athenian society because the success of democracy depended on the cooperation of the majority, a majority that could be lost if too many youth became corrupted. Achieving such cooperation, at least in the eyes of his accusers, would be impossible as long as Socrates continued practicing philosophy, which meant that Socrates and philosophy in general would need to be removed. During his trial, Socrates made a point of distinguishing two different sets of accusers. The first set of accusers were comprised of those citizens of Athens who had slandered Socrates and his practices, many of whom became familiar with Socrates by seeing Aristophanes' comedy, The Clouds. The second set of accusers consisted of Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, the Athenians who actually brought Socrates to trial. But it was the first group who Socrates believed to be more dangerous because they included the many nameless people who helped spread misinformation about Socrates over many years, who were themselves unaware that they were told falsities about Socrates or had simply misinterpreted Aristophanes' message in the clouds. In contrast, the second set of accusers was focused primarily around the three men who brought the indictment against Socrates. Socrates suggested that the second set of accusers were victims themselves, noting that it was the persuasion over their minds during childhood, primarily from the clouds and from the elders who had taken Aristophanes' message as fact rather than comedy, that led them to grow hateful towards Socrates' wrongdoing. Because the slander had gone on for so long, it can perhaps be considered that the accusers' wrongful beliefs about Socrates and philosophy would not deviate no matter the outcome of the trial. For this reason, Socrates is justified in considering the first accusers to be more dangerous, as the slandering would not cease once the trial had concluded and more people would see the clouds, which would only further the spread of misinformation, whereas the ones who indicted him would no longer have a case against him once the trial concluded. In conclusion, it is clear that Socrates was more concerned with those who bought into the rumors and took Aristophanes at his word than with the men who simply brought him to trial. Socrates was right to place his fear in this way because the damage to his reputation by the word of mouth of the many would be more severe and more long-lasting than the indictment of the few. As it was in times of antiquity, so it remains today. There are many instances where the result of a legal case do not matter because broader public opinion of an individual is often more damaging to that person's reputation than the verdict or punishment made in a courtroom. These slanders spread by word of mouth travel very quickly across generations, and once the damage is done, there is almost nothing that can change it.
Susie's paper on Winter's Tale is Laughing at Sin. Susie.
What Shakespeare gives with one hand, he often takes away with the other. In The Winter's Tale, one of his final plays, this dichotomous enterprise is proven over and over again. Regarded as one of Shakespeare's problem plays, The Winter's Tale seems to have certain characteristics of a tragedy, as well as certain characteristics of a comedy. However, not enough characteristics of each to be clearly defined as either one. Though regarded in the first folio as a comedy, the first 3 acts of The Winter's Tale lead us to believe it is a tragic story, while the final 2 acts take a drastic turn of events and reshape the plot into a comedic tale. Nonetheless, there are multiple discrepancies in both sections that contradict their given genres and blur the lines even further as both comedic and tragic elements that from the beginning are understatedly dispersed throughout the play. The Winter's Tale has thus left many questioning as to where it falls on Shakespeare's genre spectrum. The first 3 acts of The Winter's Tale are filled with drama, jealousy, and emotional distress. Regardless of his lack of substantial proof, Leontes, king of Sicilia, is convinced his pregnant wife Hermione is cheating on him with his childhood friend Polixenes, king of Bohemia, who has been in Sicilia visiting his old friend for the past 9 months. After witnessing a seemingly innocent encounter between Hermione and Polixenes, Leontes loses all rationality and turns on his loved ones in a fit of jealous rage. Leontes becomes obsessed in the situation as he understands it, and attempts to have his friend poisoned, his wife imprisoned, and his young daughter burned and beaten. The acceleration with which Leontes descends into animosity is particularly unsettling. His willingness to isolate himself and cast off his family and friends alike without addressing even the possibility of a personal misunderstanding appears irrational, eager, and by all means tragic. Camillo, like everyone else in Leontes' court, sides with Hermione and decides to act as a double agent, informing Polixenes of Leontes' plan. They both flee to Bohemia, and Hermione is placed on trial. Even after being backed by the oracle as not guilty, Leontes refuses to believe in his wife and her innocence, and she is convicted. However, while the trial is still going on, a lord interrupts with the news of Mamilius' death. Hermione faints and is later reported by Paulina to be dead. It is unclear just how Mamilius dies, and indeed that very question goes unanswered. It is made obvious from early on that Mamilius could have played a major political role in Sicilia if he were to live to be king. However, he dies before he gets the chance. Mamilius' death is particularly devastating, not only because he was a young and promising heir, but because he was the only character outside of Hermione, Leontes, and Polixenes that could have potentially answered the question of infidelity that caused the entire controversy in the first place. However, he offers some insight before he dies. When Leontes initially suspects Hermione of adultery, He turns to Mamilius and asks him, "Art thou my boy?" To which Mamilius responds, "Aye, my good lord." Leontes, unwilling to accept this answer, asks him again, "Art thou my calf?" To which Mamilius responds, "Yes, if you will, my lord." In this second question, it seems as though Leontes is seeking self-assurance and solace through his son. This seems odd because although Mamilius is wise beyond his years, he is still just a boy. Nevertheless, his answer remains perplexing. The clause, "if you will," suggests multiple conclusions. This could imply that Mamilius will only accept being Leontes' son if Leontes' love for him is self-imposed and unconditional. This could also imply that it is up to Leontes to discern for himself, suggesting that adultery is perhaps a possibility. Or perhaps it suggests that the genetics of the situation are wholly irrelevant. Mamilius' premature and untimely death gives the third act a somber and sentimental tone, both regretful and tragic. The point at which the play takes a dramatic turn and shifts from tragic to comedic is when Antigonus drops Perdita off on the fugitive coast of Bohemia. Though she was born in the peak of a tragedy, the play shifts gears and begins to focus more on circumstances that she faces in true comedic fashion. However, Shakespeare follows this up with the death of Antigonus in the famous stage direction, Exit Pursued by a Bear. This direction is simultaneously gruesome and whimsical, devastating and bizarre, tragic and comedic. Antigonus' death blends the two genres together, making for a smooth transition from tragedy to comedy. In that moment, tragedy and comedy fuse together through the death of an individual and the new life of another. It is also in this moment the play splits into two different and contrasting parts, which we come to realize when we rejoin the narrative 16 years later. Though the ending seems to work out comedically for the characters who are still present, they seem to forget that two people over the course of the play, Mamilius and Antigonus, have died. This blend of death and building of community makes the overall genre of the play hard to discern. Shakespeare's blending of the two genres perhaps gives insight on his opinion of a greater message. The Winter's Tale has strong elements of religion sprinkled throughout all 5 acts. The play is set in a seemingly pagan society. The characters make countless references to the gods, astrological forces, and divine powers, most obviously with Apollo's oracle in Act 3. However, at its core, the essence of the play is overwhelmingly Christian. Starting with the concept of original sin, temptation, and infidelity, followed by the unjust death of a son, followed by resurrection, forgiveness, and repentance, the play itself is structured similarly to the New Testament. However, this clash of ideology is not to show which religion is dominant or more moral over the other. In Christianity, all people are sinners and must seek forgiveness by God to repent. By Act 5 of the play, it seems as though Leontes is truly shameful and self-aware, a long way from where he was in the beginning. He must seek the grace of God, perhaps through the reconciliation of the graceful Perdita, that he believes it will be possible. However, no amount of repentance can undo what he has done to his son, his court, or Sicilia. This perhaps is a reminder that regardless of one's search for religious acceptance and repentance, while forgiveness is possible, forgetting one's sins often is not. The play also stresses that time heals all wounds, and in this case quite literally by the chorus time, bridging the gap between tragedy and comedy. It is only after Leontes displays himself as genuine, actively seeking forgiveness, and is truly interested in redemption, qualities originally sought after him by Mamilius, that he can be condemned by some greater power. For Leontes, all of these things take time. The characters in The Winter's Tale get into the most trouble when they assume the role of attempting to control each other's fate. Antigonus tampers with Perdita's fate by trying to save her life. Leontes not only goes against, but outright rejects the oracle. Both Antigonus and Leontes feel the wrath when they assume too much power over the lives of others and refuse to respect the divine. This play provides both a warning and a reminder that no matter how powerful we become as mortals, we are still just that, and perhaps there is a more powerful voice rendering our fate. The audience never figures out for certain whether or not Perdita was the child of Leontes or Polixenes. We also never quite figure out Hermione's motives behind the scheme or Paulina's role in the play overall. That being said, we can classify the play as overall as both genres or a tragicomedy. Shakespeare's later plays have often been similar to that of The Winter's Tale, in that they share qualities of both a tragedy and comedy and are often classified as tragic comedies or romances. However, categorization of the play overall seems insignificant. The Winter's Tale should be looked upon as not a tragedy or a comedy, but rather a work in and of itself, not confined to a particular genre. By offering both qualities of tragedy and comedy, the insight of the play offers on religion, forgiveness, time, and family far surpasses its ability to make audiences laugh and cry.
Our second paper is by Annie Pertner, and Annie is you were in English, I think, last year, but you moved into education, is that right?
I'm English and social justice.
English and social justice. Well, then your transcript is completely wrong.
Oh, women's gender studies minor.
No, it has secondary education.
Yeah, that's wrong.
Yes, that's wrong. Okay. She's in English, social justice, major in women and gender studies minor. And Annie was a sophomore when she took the class. She transferred into the honors program. And she's a junior now, and I like her very much. Only because she attended a discussion I led on John Ford's movie *The Searchers*, and met my daughter, which is always a good thing. And her paper is on *The Winter's Tale*, the convergence of comedy and tragedy in play. Annie.
Throughout the play, The Winter's Tale, Shakespeare weaves multiple paradoxical elements to create a complex and sometimes confusing piece of literary work. These contrasting plot lines, mood, and characters highlight different themes throughout the play. While the multiple dichotomies that exist within the play seem to only complicate, these contradictory factors can in fact create clarity when viewed simultaneously. The most prevalent and alarming dichotomy is that of the abrupt shift of the play from a tragedy to a comedy. This stark difference in the mood of the play that occurs after the third act, however, can be understood in an interesting way when other disparities such as the ambiguous time period and the contrasting Christian and pagan practices are viewed along with it. The first three acts of The Winter's Tale are comprised of the traditional disconcerting markers of a tragic play. Mamilius as a character is a perfect embodiment of the tragedy that occurs in these first three acts. After the tyrannical signs of Leontes' jealousy begin to sweep Sicilia, Mamilius tells his mother a story and thus becomes the narrator of the remaining tragedy. Mamilius, when asked to tell a tale, chooses a somber one and explains this tale as a sad tale best for winter. This tale is set in a churchyard, and as he whispers it to his mother and the play unfolds, this very tale becomes their own horrid fate. Mamilius is further represented as a tragic character due to his untimely and devastating fate. Unlike Hermione's perceived death, that later adds to the comedic tangent of the play, Mamilius dies and is not resurrected. The last two comedic acts seem to transform almost every disastrous circumstance from the beginning of the play into one that is merely necessary in order to set up the preceding fairy tale. However, Mamilius' fate is final, devastating, and also seemingly ignored in the last happy scenes. The play opens with elders of the community expecting great things from the young Mamilius, and his fate in the midst of his father's tyrannical explosion affects the kingdom politically, causes Hermione's perceived death, and urges Leontes to understand his jealousy in a more logical way. There is absolutely nothing comedic about the sudden and final and tragic death of the royal prodigy Mamilius. The tragedy of the first few acts are recited by Mamilius and finalized with the kingdom's reaction to his death. Mamilius may be the character that best embodies the tragedy that occurs in the first three acts. However, Leontes' rash and abrasive actions concerning his wife's faithfulness ignite the dark and tragic tone in which the first half of the play exists. Leontes, concerned with the truthfulness of his wife and the paternity of his children, rages out of control to the point of legally trying his wife with her life in the balance. Her life in the balance. This jealousy has the ability to be perceived as a disease, one of the many that is spoke of plaguing the nation. Jealousy and the rash questioning of something as intimate as the paternity of Leontes' believed children can be seen as both a moral misstep and a disease-like persona that Leontes readily embodies. This intense focus on disease also lends to the tragic tone of the first half of the play. The topic of disease, the spread of this disease, and the connection of disease with Leontes' tyrannical rampage is referred to multiple times, exemplifying the dark, dreary tone of the first three acts. Everything from Leontes' flaw of intense jealousy to Hermione's physical reaction to the death of her child is spoken of with metaphors and references to physical illness. This illness that has spread across the nation, however, seems to be a fog that is lifted by the following two acts and the return home of Perdita, the lost royal daughter. This intense difference between two halves of the play is outlined by the different fates of Leontes' two heirs. The last two contrasting comedic acts are propelled into the light fable and reminiscent tone immediately with the presence of Perdita. Perdita's story of beauty, humble uprisings, unnoticed royal blood, young love, ultimate reunion, and reassertion to royalty reflects the tone of a fairy tale. In fact, with the absence of the first two acts, dominated by Mamilius' tragic tale and finalized with his death, Perdita's story would be just that, a fairy tale. The pagan and the Christian characteristics traverse the strictly divided tragedy and comedy in the play, providing a display of Shakespeare's masterful ability to connect the contradictory. The extreme and immediate switch from tragedy to comedy, separated by 16 years, may seem to break the play The Winter's Tale into confusing and conflicting parts. However, it is easy to see that many of the contradictions in Shakespeare's play are in fact meticulously placed. The play is able to simultaneously embody different factors, time periods, religious practices, and classic storytelling techniques. More importantly, The Winter's Tale is able, with the aid of the endless contradictions, to create a story null of premise, place, and time. The characters flourish while the background clashes and that sometimes enlightens, but oftentimes dissipates. In The Winter's Tale, the reader pities the tragic hero, revels the princess's beauty, laughs with the petty thief, and sympathizes with the ordinary. The reader hopes for redemption, expects magic, and is rewarded with a happy ending. The expert weaving of these factors by Shakespeare allows tragedy to become comedy and the seemingly ecstatic reunion embedded with a serious and tragic lesson.
We now turn to our third paper on The Winter's Tale and the final paper of our conference by Monica Hawkins. And Monica wrote the paper as a freshman. She's currently a sophomore. She's also an RA at Roosevelt, and she is majoring in, I'll get this wrong, something that's not philosophy.
Accounting.
In accounting. No, I had remembered that. She is also a devout St. Louis Cardinals baseball fan. And since the Cardinals are in the, what is it, the
NLCS?
Thank you, the NLCS, the National League, whatever that stands for, conference finals, and she is watching them play, I presume, with some intensity.
Yes.
So we'll put some temporal moment on our conference, and her paper is on the temporal confusion of Christianity and paganism in Winter's Tale. Monica.
What makes the understanding of time so critical to society is its ability to further the comprehension one has of the things they read and learn about. Time is similar to a unit of account. One cannot fully grasp an occurrence without knowing when it took place. The imagination is free to think of anything, but there is always a setting involved, and time is something that builds a foundation of what one conjures up in their head. Reading words on a page would be meaningless without imagination, and imagination would lack its depth without time. One of the most read playwrights in history is Shakespeare, and it is apparent in his writing of The Winter's Tale that he is aware of how time influences our understanding and changes the way we view and interpret things. Shakespeare does not deliberately make it clear that time is ambiguous in The Winter's Tale, but he combines two differing religions that make the setting unclear. Paganism is associated with tragedy in the first half of the play and Christianity with comedy in the second, but is not a simple division of two halves as Shakespeare uses. The Winter's Tale is 5 acts, but many who have read it see it as 2 acts that are told by 2 different characters. The first half of the play is told by Mamilius, who is Leontes' son that dies in the 3rd act. There are preceding events that lead to Mamilius' death that create a tragic and sorrowful first half of the play. These events have a strong influence from paganism, but there are also aspects of Christianity mixed in. The final 2 acts of The Winter's Tale are then told by time, and the tone of the play takes a wide turn from a tragedy to somewhat of a comedy. Time is the central character of this play, but their presence is only written in at the beginning of the 4th act. The one scene that time appears in is not the sole contributor to the setting of The Winter's Tale, but it does play a significant role in the temporal confusion of the play. There are references to both a pagan world and a Christian world, and these references come together to form a play of mixed religion and ambiguous time. Shakespeare writes this play with both pagan and Christian characters whose actions and words are of both religions, and this fusion of religion with time sets up The Winter's Tale as a play without one specific setting or faith. When time takes over in Act 4, there is still no clear distinction of where The Winter's Tale is taking place. The play moves quickly into a different type of play by the 4th act, but it continues to leave time to be wondered about and questioned. Time says, "Let me pass the same I am ere ancient order was, or what is now received." The new storyteller in the present Christian world to continue the play, but it is from a time before the current mandates and cultures existed that likely belonged to a pagan faith. This leaves the understanding to be that there is not a set place in time, which extends the ambiguity along the lack of a set religion in The Winter's Tale. The jump of time from the 3rd to 4th act only adds to the confusion of when the play is happening, and there is never one specific reference to a time or place that stays consistent throughout the play. The clearest connection to one specific religion is through the characters' names. Most of the characters have a pagan name, but their actions end up speaking to a combination of religious beliefs. Paganism is polytheistic and would not make a good combination with Christianity, but the brilliance of the playwright Shakespeare shows that it is entirely possible. The true father of Perdita is never revealed, and the time of the play is not shown, and this confusion only enhances The Winter's Tale. Shakespeare avoids the typical omniscient view the reader gets and leaves them to decide the setting and fate of the play. Shakespeare puts two different religions together with the characters' names and actions, and time becomes a featured character that merges two different worlds and settings to create one of the many masterpieces written by the English playwright.